very philosophical at all. It's more of a historical social science treatise. In fact, there's only one mention of Gandhi in the entire aspects of the beginning. The name of the author is a guy named Richard Falk, and he represents a quote here from Gandhi that is attributed to him in 1931. Gandhi supposedly said, "I feel in the innermost recesses of my heart that the world is sick unto death of blood spilling. The world is seeking a way out, and I flatter myself with the belief that perhaps it will be the privilege of the ancient land of India to show the way out to a hungering world." Basically, the chapter is about whether or not we as a global community have moved closer towards the Gandhian moment of realizing that bloodshed and war is not the answer, or if we've regressed from it. And he kind of looks at it from a chronological time point since the 1970s as to how far we've actually progressed or gotten away from the Gandhian moment. First, we'll take a look at 1978 to 2001. I'm not really sure why he arbitrarily chose 1978 as the beginning of modernity, but it's the way he did. And you'll see here two images which are kind of representative of the modern era. You have this one representing perestroika. I could have picked glasnost, but I picked perestroika for a very specific reason we'll get to later on. And obviously we have a man here in sub-Saharan Africa who's dying from AIDS. It's one of the most pressing issues in the history of humanity. First, I'm going to talk about the progression that's happened since 1978. There's a couple of instances here, such as the Iranian Revolution. You have progressive moves throughout Asia, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Nelson Mandela, South Africa in 1994. The thing about Nelson Mandela, South Africa is everybody thinks that kind of ushered in a new era of peace, when in reality is South Africa is still kind of rampant with crime and widespread violence. So it's a very nice symbolic gesture, but it did not solve all of the ills of that part of the world. And the author gives a couple of reasons why he thinks these things occurred and why we're moving towards a more progressive state. He says that in general we've had a disillusionment with revolutionary war, oppressive government. And as you can see, we have less communist countries than we did circa 1970. We still have oppressive regimes, but we're moving more towards liberalization of society as a whole. Obviously, you had the end of the nuclear standoff around 1991, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. You started seeing reparations for ethnic cleansing victims, specifically those in the Holocaust, which became a very big movement in the 1990s. These last two, I think, are probably the most important, and we'll get to these at the very end of the presentation, so why I think they're incredibly important to peace studies in general. And that's that in that time frame, we had increased attention towards human rights violations and abuses, and especially the recognition of historical injustices, which I think are very vital to us ever getting past war as a central component of our species. And of course, we had regression in that time frame. We had warfare in the Balkans. We have obviously the AIDS crisis in sub-Saharan Africa. And there have been many attempts at democratic revolution in Asia, and obviously they do not always turn out for the best for those that are involved.
Do you all recognize that picture?
Tiananmen Square.
Tiananmen Square, yeah. Apparently the story is that if you go back to that slide, this guy was on his way home from work. He had stopped at a grocery store and was caught up in the fervor of the moment. He's not a part of it. This was mostly a student-led demonstration, and just decided, on the spur of the moment, to step in front of this line of tanks coming down the street. Of course, then they took him away.
He's actually sort of
serendipitous, totally unplanned, and it's become one of the most famous images of that time.
Yeah, he's definitely kind of become sort of a folk legend. Really, nobody knows who he was. There are about 20 different stories about why he showed up. So that's one of many competing theories as to who this person is.
Right.
Never actually identified him to the general public, so it's sort of become this mythical figure. And Mr. Falk has a very, very interesting statement here where he talks about the regression of the time frame. And he says that the negative effects of globalization were causing growing disparities in wealth and income, environmental decay, and a pervasive disregard of human suffering, which cast a dark shadow across the achievements of the globalized and technologicalized 1990s. And this leads us to another key paradigm in the history of humanity, and especially Western civilization. Page 366, he states, "The passions that rage on the planet suggest an impending encounter between extremists, whether religious or secular, locked in a total war, and the visionary warriors that constitute the global civil society who believe in a future based on peace, justice, and sustainability," which of course is embodied by September 11, 2001. The author knows something very interesting about Al-Qaeda in the United States, and that's that as entities they have many similarities. Both, he states, are waging a borderless war on a global scale. Both view the opponent as the embodiment of evil. Neither are traditional sovereign states. And the first time I read that, I kind of said, well, obviously that's not true with America. We are definitely a sovereign state. Obviously we have physical borders. But is America really just a country, or is it actually a global movement? Is America just the 50 states we have here, or is it our expansive military presence around the world, or our economic presence across the world, and all of our industries and our brands and our trademarks?
Or linguistic.
Exactly. The lingua franca is English, obviously another embodiment of American imperialism or cultural imperialism. And he says that neither are battling a traditional civil war. What he means there is we're not actually fighting for any sort of specific land, not a specific resource. We're just fighting this ideologically based battle.
You know, on that note, compare the first, after the 9/11 event, the first public speech that Bush gives, and the first communique from Al-Qaeda that supposedly is from bin Laden himself. And they're strikingly similar in language and imagery and judgments.
Is a war more than most wars in which the idea of limits is rejected by both sides, which Mr. Falk says on page 368. And even in our discrepancies between the U.S. and Al-Qaeda, there are still some pretty striking similarities, which is the fact that Al-Qaeda is a secretive organization in 60 states and territories, whereas the U.S. is a global state involved militarily in 60 countries. He makes the statement that the U.S. represents state violence as a tool, whereas Al-Qaeda represents terrorism, when basically they're doing pretty much the same thing, just by different means. And this is what I think the entire the story of 9/11 was in the War on Terror, is it represents globalization versus jihad. Globalization is the idea that the entire world is moving towards a certain economically driven state by technology, in which all the countries in the world are interconnected through commerce. And of course that means you have to change certain segments or establishments within your society. And I suppose the jihadists are basically sort of reactionary to that. They don't want to change their culture. They don't want to accept these economic models and all these infrastructure that we have as part of globalization. So contrary to what our fine President George W. Bush said, we will not attack because they, and I quote, hate freedom. So this brings us to a very interesting passage in the book where he brings up Malaysian Prime Minister Maha Thor, who you can obviously tell is actually Muslim. And he made this speech in February 24, 2003, where he kind of commented on the War on Terror and how it kind of harks back to Gandhi's idea how we can achieve peace through finally getting over our dependency on war. Just kind of summarize what Maha Thor's speech was about. We may want to remain uninvolved and to avoid incurring the displeasure of powerful countries, but our people are getting restless. We want us to do something. If we don't, then they will, and they will go against us. They will take things in their own hands. Unable to mount a conventional war, they will resort to guerrilla war, terrorism against us, against those they consider to be their oppressors. So basically, it's kind of summarizing why terrorism takes place, the mindset of that specific way of branching out. And then he continues to look at it from the U.S. perspective. What's the other side? They now no longer respect borders, international laws, or simple moral values. They're even talking of using nuclear weapons. This is no longer a war against terrorism. It is in fact a war to dominate the world. And the most important threat that we face now is the tendency of the powerful to wage war when faced with opposition to the spread of their dominance. And Maha Thor has a proposal he mentions in the book, which is almost identical to what Gandhi said. Of course, there are some changes to make it more modern. But I have his quote listed here at the top, and Gandhi's original quote there, in which he says that many of their people are also sick of war. They have come out in their millions to protest the warlike policies of their leaders. War must be outlawed. That will have to be our struggle now. We must struggle for justice and freedom from oppression, from economic hegemony. When Japan was defeated, it was allowed to spend only 1% of its gross domestic product on its armed forces, which is not the case, obviously, now. If such a condition can be imposed on Japan, why can it not be imposed on all countries? It's a very idealistic but interesting comment. Which leads us to this conclusion, which I think kind of brings about the closest answer I've come to actually achieving nonviolence as a believable, feasible global goal. If the Gandhian moment is to be realized, then it must encompass both concerns with the violence of weapons and the violence of inequitable structures of domination and exploitation. And this is the one I think is really, really pivotal. We have talked about this in class. Perhaps unwittingly, the visibility of this violence due to the globalization of media coverage, especially TV, will hasten the process by which the people of the world, sick from violence and the suffering entailed, will hasten the awakening of conscience and commitment needed to carry forward the struggle for a non-violent world order. When he talks about media coverage, basically what I think he means is two things. We need knowledge and we need comprehension. Unless you have knowledge of what's actually happening, and the media can help expedite that, get things out there, knowledge of what's really happening in the world, you can't have peace. And even if you have knowledge, unless you know why that occurred, if you don't understand why people do the things they do, their traditions, their culture, the way they think, then you can't have peace either. So I believe to achieve the Gandhian moment, as the author states, and the way I kind of believe as well, we have to move towards not only knowing what's happening in the world, but actually make an effort to understand what's going on in the world as well. So if there are any questions, go ahead and ask them. We have a minute left. So I'm proud of that.
Very good. But you did, truth be told, you did have one of the shortest chapters.
Oh, well, I mean, there was so much content and history you had to go over as well. I mean, it's a lot of research.
I've got one. I'm interested in hearing your view of, I've been hearing on the news lately, accounts of I think he's the only person who is now being tried by the United States in Guantanamo Bay for the bombing of the USS Cole. And so I'm wondering if you're familiar with that event, how you comprehend that moment. In light of what you're talking about, particularly this comparison between jihad and globalization.
Well, these were the bottom of the USS Cole in 1998, I believe. This is another reactionary event. You can only do what you can do. If you don't have a voice in politics or a voice in the society or a way to kind of actually change things for the better through diplomatic, peaceful means, people are obviously going to resort to terrorism. And we see that all the time in the U.S. You don't have a job. What do? You may commit a violent act. There's no real ideological principle why you do the violence. You're just doing it out of necessity because it's attractive. And I think it's probably at the heart of terrorism in all its incarnations. It's not because you have sort of some moral imperative behind it. It's doing it because it's what you want. I think we kind of tend to over-politicize these kind of things. There's a very simplistic reason why people do all these criminal activities. I don't think terrorism really has as much to do with philosophy as much as it does just basic utility.
Any other questions?